Hello everyone, welcome to track 2, noontime speech. I know it's lunchtime, so hopefully you guys aren't too hungry. Again, just a big thanks to the team and staff here at CornCon for coming and supporting this conference in person. I really appreciate it. I have up for you next John Bambenek from Threat Intelligence Advisor from Netenrich. You said that right? Ooh, thank goodness. He's going to give us a great talk on embracing the SOC, which everyone knows. So I'll do. Here's John. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you everybody for giving up a little bit of your lunch hour. I actually have a new title at Netenrich. I was formerly on the advisory board. Now I'm actually a full-time employee as the principal threat hunter for the company. I do have my own boutique threat intelligence firm, Bambenek Consulting, where I sell threat feeds. I also recently went back to get my master's in cybersecurity and now finishing my PhD in machine learning, in cybersecurity machine learning. A couple of aspects I'll talk about in this talk, but because I like the abuse, I decided to do a thesis. And I've led several large threat intel sharing groups investigating large-scale threats. I've been working in this industry for 22 years, and have the scars to prove it. So I'm hitting the wrong button. There we go. Obviously, if you didn't get a sense of where I was going from the title of this talk, we have unlimited job security because there's significant flaws in pretty much every aspect of our tech stack, and we're adopting this stack into new functions all the time that only increase the scope and severity of the kind of problems that we can face. And because I'm Irish, by nature, I find humor in existential dread. So I find this funny. But the less memifying version is fundamentally, cybersecurity is not a technology problem. It's a human nature problem. And we've been killing and thieving since the beginning of time, right? The Bible as purely historical literature, not talking theology at this point, the second generation was Cain killing Abel, right? And I have 6 kids, 4 of whom are boys, and can see firsthand the fratricidal nature of mankind is still present in this generation. What the internet has changed is really the scale and scope of the problem. We've had check fraud and various forms of financial fraud forever, right? Now people in Russia can engage in credit card fraud against victims in the United States without physically exposing themselves. We can do bank robberies without people walking into a bank with guns, which has lots of risks. You can do it over greater distances. What's important there is jurisdiction issues, right? I spend a lot of my time investigating cybercrime that never really much comes of it because we can't arrest anybody. The criminals may be breaking laws in the United States, but if they live in Nigeria or Russia or China, occasionally we've had wins. Most of the time we don't. All of the current ransomware gangs are operated by people who know better than to go someplace where the United States can touch them, or anywhere in the Western world can touch them. Occasionally we get some affiliates or some ancillary groups. Sometimes somebody makes a stupid decision. But crime does pay on the internet, as long as you're smart enough to pick your victims. And the greatest trend, right, is even though we can't address any of the above, we are adopting technology that continues to increase risk. In the 90s, we didn't say cybersecurity, we said information security, right? Because really what we're dealing with was misuses of information, fraud, and the like. Technology is creating a world where we can get people killed using technology. And it's been used to facilitate that. We'll talk about a couple of incidents of that in a couple of slides. But the bottom line is the stuff that we've done, or technology we've done 10 years ago, still isn't safe, right? In any proper definition of safe. We can't really make it safe, right? Email is a great example, right? Everybody uses email to do all sorts of things, right? A lot of people are buying and selling houses right now because of the housing market. You want to get a mortgage, you got to send tax returns, right? I've gone through this process twice, yelling at bankers saying, oh, just email me your tax return. No. I'm not going to email you a tax return. Oh, here's the routing and account number to do wiring transfers and closing. Don't email that to me. Pick up the phone. It's a $100,000 transaction that warrants a 30-second phone call. A $20 transaction, okay, we could do that over email, right? But for most people, buying and selling a house is the most expensive transaction they will engage in, unless they've gone Breaking Bad or selling meth. So, but we do this over email. Something that was made in 1979 and 1980, the protocol, you kind of staple security on it. But those of us who've done this for a while realize that if you don't make something secure and architect something secure to begin with, you really can't make it secure in the end. The process to create mainframe technology and make that secure in the 60s was immense. And then we went to client server and web apps, and no one went through that same process a second time. It's expensive, it's time consuming, and ain't nobody want to spend money on it. So here we are. Bad news is, all these fundamental problems still exist. Good news is, unlimited job security, right? I'm in my 40s, right? I'm about 10 years away from that age when men start becoming unemployable because no one wants to pay us what we're worth. That's not a problem in cybersecurity. There's just too much work to do. Everybody probably has this. How many people have webcam cameras on their laptops? Right? I can think of no bigger physical manifestation of our complete failure as an industry to solve simple problems. Because it was 10 years ago, director of the FBI, James Comey, now famous for other reasons, but we'll skip past that. It was on CNN for something, and says, oh, how do you secure your laptop, right? He goes, oh, I put a little webcam camera over this. You are the director of one of the largest and most well-funded intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies in the world. And our tax dollars cannot prevent this man from being spied onto his webcam, so we put plastic in front of him. This is our solution to problems, right? As we can't solve them, and that's okay. Now that's an amusing anecdote, right, of webcams, right? But now we have, in essence, webcams on our cell phones. We've adopted the same technology, just put it in a mobile platform. The threat landscape here, right, is really, we're talking about men creeping on younger women and hopefully finding them in a state of undress. The same technology gets put in cell phones. Here's your threat landscape. I'm going to imagine some of you may know the person on the left. For those of you who don't, he was a journalist for the Washington Post, Jamal Khashoggi. Malware was put on his phone to help facilitate luring him into an embassy where he was not exactly humanely killed. His mobile device helped facilitate that. Some of the same stuff we're talking about. On the right is Uyghur Muslims. For those of you who pay attention to that human rights tragedy and genocide, if we're being honest, to Uyghur Muslims inside mainland China. There is a lot of surveillance the Chinese government does targeted at these individuals and their phones to find out not just about their targets, but who their targets are talking to so that they can add more targets to put them in concentration camps. This is the wild world we're creating with the technology when we take existing things and just put it into a new platform thinking, hey, there's neat stuff I can do with this. There's neat stuff I can do with my cell phone. I can see, I'm 3 hours away from my oldest son in high school. I can real-time notice of when he misses homework assignments. 25 years ago, when I was in high school, my parents had to nag me or call my teachers to figure out what was due and what wasn't, and their first insight was a report card, right? Now I'm on my son within, hours notice. I probably couldn't be here today. I'm a single parent of that child, right? I wouldn't be able to be 3 hours away if it weren't for a cell phone and some of the apps we have. But there's downsides too. And I suppose, for those of you who are still students, there's downsides to your parents having that kind of visibility into your studies also. But high-level trends of the threat landscape, right? There's lots of phishing, malicious documents, for initial foothold. It's easy to get people to click on something, relatively speaking. I'll show you a couple examples. But one of my favorite phishing exercise for a pen test of a client I work for was sent to all of the developers. It was like 10,000 developers in this company. Sent them an Excel spreadsheet. The lure was, hey, Facebook's building a data center in this town. Look at this spreadsheet, which will let you know what your salary range could be. And I mean, you had to go and really spend effort, like enable macros, do this. They made it so it wasn't easy to open the file, and I would just beacon out. And they found out some absurd percentage, like 80–90% of people actually went through all the steps. And, and they were like, oh, this is horrible, we need to do security awareness training. No, that's not your risk. I mean, that is a risk, but it's not the risk. The risk is that 80 or 90% of your developers are so anxious to get out of a company as technologists who are irritated when they can't get the information they want quickly, and still button mash to figure out how fast they can run out the door. That is a more profound problem than a security problem. Attackers live off the land, right? We think of hacking as malware-based. Malware is still a role, but a lot of the tools we use to manage our own environment, the attackers get access to and then manage our environment for their gain. Why create tools that can be attributed or might get caught by antivirus or endpoint tools when I can simply use SolarWinds to relive a story from how the Russians canceled Christmas last year. Supply chain is a big thing, right? If I can attack one target and get 1,000 victims, that's pretty darn efficient. Both cyber criminals and nation states are highly economic actors in the sense of they want to maximize their return on investment. They do the same kind of calculations that we do, justifying business expenses, right? And they know that, hey, if I kick over SolarWinds, I get lots of stuff, or CodeCov. There's a lot of interesting attacks, not a lot, there was 2 major breaches of Azure, and 1 zero-day that was announced yesterday, right? Why bother going into one target environment, or if I can go where a lot of industry has their cloud resources? It's a lot simpler, right? And there's too many too many resources for attackers to use of compromised accounts and infrastructure. They're at no want for starting points and footholds in their attacks. So to start, talking about malicious documents, this is a 0-day that was announced Tuesday, maybe, or maybe it was Friday, relatively recent. My contact information is at the end of the slide. I'll happily email you the slide to save the effort of taking pictures. If you, This CV, basically, in an Office document, can create a malicious ActiveX control that bypasses the enable this, all the pop-up dialogues to do remote code execution. Right? It's seen in targeted attacks, which is always a nice euphemism for spy agencies doing bad things, right? Presumably Eastern on Western targets. And we'll probably see, I'm sure it's probably hitting target environments for commodity attacks now, because whenever a patch comes out, it's usually 24 to 48 hours tops before it's reverse engineered, and then everybody in the world starts using it for a couple of weeks to get everybody who's straggling to do patches. The reality is this technique has been around for a while. This just saves a couple of steps for attackers. But like I said, it's the inclusion of scripting languages in Office files, while useful for certain applications, also creates tremendous risk. But if you think about it, Office has existed since the 90s. I don't know exactly when Office was created. My first introduction was in the Air Force in '95, because how they train military officers is teach them how to do PowerPoint presentations, because that's how we fight wars these days, is with PowerPoint slides. I'm sarcastic, but only a little bit. But it's been around for at least 26 years, right, give or take. Still haven't figured out a way to use it safely, right, in terms of conveying information between organizations. My first explosion of malicious documents was in 2005, give or take. The Chinese do fantastic work with malicious documents, by the way, right? I am obviously not a fan of their government or their policies, but the expertise they do in this technique is just amazing. And Adobe included JavaScript functionality early on in PDF readers, and they were using this to compromise, Falun Gong and Tibetans in Canada. It was great work, right? And they've been doing it forever. But ultimately, right, it's JavaScript, ActiveX, macros, you name it, we're putting scripting functionality into Office documents which means I can send a document to go do something in the target environment. Our solution for this is pop-up dialogues. And as I mentioned from my earlier anecdote, if you got the right enough lure, people will button mash through all those dialogues, right? You know, there's a lot of businesses and industries right now who are cash strapped. You send them something that says PO, somebody might button mash all the way through that because a PO means somebody wants to pay you, send them an invoice so they can pay you, right? So it's a great lure. One of my favorite lures was this one. You probably can't see it clearly in the back, right? But it's just an email that purported to be a subpoena. You know, United States District Court, you know, you're commanded to appear before a grand jury. You can see little bits and pieces if you're a little bit savvy about how this is not somebody with a proper understanding of the court, right? Grand juries don't take place in civil court. You know, I think below this, it talks about a local prosecutor in federal court, right? It's not a U.S. attorney. There's a couple of instances of British English versus proper American war-winning English, right? But this was sent just to CEOs west of the Mississippi, this particular one, about 1,400 CEOs of major companies. 99% click rate, right? A good phishing campaign for a criminal's perspective is like 5%. They're happy with 1% because email is cheap, right? Email 2 million people, who cares, right? If you got to be a little bit more discreet, you've got time to kill, right? This actually had U.S. attorneys clicking on it because, well, major CEOs of companies also tend to know U.S. attorneys and can pick up the phone and be like, what the hell are you talking about? You're making me appear in front of a grand jury. And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about, send me this. And they click on it, and it got people in the Justice Department. It's fantastic. And all this campaign did was steal address books and encryption keys, right? It's just a very targeted, specific smash and grab of some pretty sensitive stuff. And like I said, for tradecraft of espionage, you know, I want to map the entire American economy. How should I do that? Why not just steal the address book? Because every time you email somebody, it usually puts an entry in there. If there's public or private keys, you can see who really matters. Now I've mapped relationships of an entire economy with one low-rent phishing campaign. Right? Think of how many people in meat space that would take to accomplish that. You know, because that's usually how intelligence scales, is you throw people at a problem. In fact, that's how China solves most of their problems. They throw people at it, but they still use technology in great ways. To continue the point about email, right? Business email compromise is a thing. Usually involves compromising an email account and forwarding information, right? We're in a glut of home sales or refinancing because of the housing market. So they simply compromise title attorneys or title companies, look for transactions and just send an update. Oh, by the way, no, here's the escrow account, send the money here. And it's dollar amounts where the bank don't need it, right? Somebody steals your debit card and steals $200, your bank's going to eat that. Somebody steals $200,000, you could be just another person, that was your retirement, and sorry, the bank ain't going to eat it. Hopefully somebody somewhere in the chain has an insurance policy. Romance scams, right? You know, particularly during the pandemic in places that are more locked down, right? The human need for romantic connection has not abated because of the virus. You know, I guess like doing Zoom dating is a thing now, you know? Well, the fundamental problem with dating online is there's a comic in the 90s. You don't know that the person on the other side of the keyboard isn't a dog. We haven't solved that problem since the 90s, and now, I mean, we could update it. You don't know the person on the other side of the keyboard is a Nigerian. And they do fantastic work in romance games. Like, fundamentally evil, don't get me wrong, I'm not justifying it. But they do great work of just convincing people they're really in love, and it's a thing, and here, send $5,000 so I can fly over there, we'll get married and whatever, and then all of a sudden, and you can't convince these victims that they're being scammed. You can tell them, but it's their money in this country, right? You know, we can't tell people not to wire money. So, you know, it's like, this is not real. They think it is. You know, and it's a problem we can't solve, right? And it's a problem that's like, this isn't even a SOC problem. Usually isn't a SOC problem, right? Unless the victim happens to be a high-ranking person in your organization, or an elected official, or some other government leader or head of an agency. All cases that I've seen where instead of trying to get a couple grand of extortion money, they're saying, oh, by the way, you know, you sent some pictures and we did some video chats, and that would probably be untoward if it got out. I'd like access to your stuff, right? I can't sell you a tool to fix that problem, right? Extortion sucks when you're on the business end of it. We all know what ransomware is, right? It's been around since 2007, or not 2007, I made that mistake twice this week, 2013. Because eventually cybercriminals figured out how to do encryption correctly, which is actually a very hard thing to do. The problem with encryption isn't the math, the problem is the implementation, right? That's what always, you know, sticks it to you. Criminals figured it out. They had Bitcoin and cryptocurrency that made moving money easy across national boundaries and is sanctions resistant. So now they kick over entire organizations. You know, hospitals get this. You know, hospitals have some pretty strong needs to stay completely operational all the time. But ultimately, it's a big math problem. There's a huge ecosystem of people behind it. They can operate with near impunity. Occasionally, we announce indictments, but they're public indictments, and somebody in St. Petersburg is like, oh, I guess the United States has indicted me. Better not go to Spain for vacation, you know? But, you know, if you're a billionaire or multimillionaire in Russia, you can still live a pretty comfortable life if you don't mind the fact that the sun never sets part of the year and the sun never comes up the other part of the year. But they also operate in a similar way. They get the initial foothold, and it's not just malware binaries, right? They're using their own tools to kick over an entire organization, right? In 2013 to 2016, give or take, right? Ransomware was, hey, you click on a maldoc, and all of a sudden your machine's infected. You pay $300 to $1,000, give or take, right? You kick over individual machines. That's more or less gone away. Now it's, we want to kick over entire organizations, which means there's an operator at the end of the keyboard who's directing the attack and making decisions of how best to do that and tailor what they're doing so that when they take you over, right, you don't have an easy means of recovery. Something that happened 2 weeks ago is a victim got ransomware. They're in the recovery process. They preemptively notified their partners and victims, hey, we got this, because ransomware also tends to leak information. So let's give advance notice to the victims, hey, maybe protect yourself because this is coming. So instead of having the 72 or 5-day deadline to pay before they leak the documents, the ransomware operator said, no, you know, you weren't a good victim, we leak them anyway. But the sheer amount of information that's leaked, we call it dark web, but it's not really dark web, of just repositories of information stolen from organizations that can be weaponized is immense. But at its core, ransomware is really a business continuity problem, something talked about in the CISSP, right? Which generally is technical practitioners who kind of, CISSP, that's like security for dummies and management. But really the one thing they have it right about CISSP is risk, but business continuity, right? Data centers don't burn to the ground. Well, OVH had that problem last year, but we'll skip past that. That's an exception, right? We're even pretty good about natural disasters. We had a major one in Louisiana. As far as I can tell, nothing really went down. And their data centers operating in New Orleans. They stayed operational. For the most part, in Katrina, 10 years prior, they stayed operational. You know, we're pretty good at that. The business interruption problem we have is ransomware, which is really, I mean, yeah, you want to prevent it getting in your organization, we'll talk about that. But it comes down to, can your backups restore information quickly, or can you restore operations quickly? You know, backups hasn't evolved much in 20 years. I mean, fundamentally, it's all on the same platform of tapes. You know, we could do things in the cloud, but actually cloud costs where it kills you is in storage. You know, that's expensive in the cloud. Everything else is pretty cheap. But many organizations have never really tested a recovery plan. You know, oh, we have backups and all the lights turn green. I've run into this several times in 20 years. Nobody pays attention to their backups, as long as there's not a proactive alert. How many people want to be, of the students here, want to be a backup guy? Now, y'all want to be pen testers, right? You know, everybody wants to do something else. There's nothing more boring in the world than backups until you need it. It's like car insurance. You know, nobody cares about car insurance unless they have to pay the bill. They want the cheapest bill possible until you have to file a claim, right? And hopefully none of you have to file a claim, because that usually means something bad has happened. But what's the plan, right? And this is basic business work, and for small to medium business in particular, not very good at it. But I mean, here's backups for the last 20, 30 years, still tape. And the tapes store more, but many organizations pay ransomware operators, not because they don't have backups, but because the downtime is more expensive than the ransom demand. It is a math problem. And in the Western world, right, business decisions are based in mercenary math. If you've got a cyber insurance company coming in, decisions are really based on mercenary math. You know, the actuaries come in and say X is greater than Y, so we're doing Y. Full stop, right? To solve that problem, right, is either create resiliency or to create resiliency and have faster recovery times. But to talk about living off the land in PowerShell in particular, right? PowerShell is a fantastic tool to manage a Windows environment. I don't know for sure because I'm an anti-Microsoft bigot and I try to avoid managing anything in Windows. But I hear from people that it's very important. In fact, I think there's a way to put PowerShell on Linux, you know, for Linux admins who have an appropriate sense of self-loathing. But everything that admins like about PowerShell, the attackers really like. I don't know that anybody's replicated this study, but I think 10 years ago, somebody said for every 24 workstations, you need one support staff. For every 4 servers, you need one support staff. Nobody operates, even at an enterprise level, of that kind of manpower. It just doesn't exist. So you've got to have automated tools to do things, right? PowerShell is a great way to do it, right? And the attackers know it's built into Windows. But there's some simple things that people can do, right? You know, there's only very specific people who need to be executing PowerShell in an environment, in your production environment anyway, right? Those are your system admins, maybe your network admins, depending on how you define your duties, right? All of these can be signed. So you can say, oh, the PowerShell script dropped by whatever, it's not signed by the trusted environments key, so I'm not going to execute it, right? So as long as you're doing proper PKI and protecting that private key, and ideally doing separation of duties where the person writing the PowerShell script isn't the one signing it and executing it, you've got a pretty resilient system in there that your DevOps guys are probably going to hate, but generally speaking, in production, at that point, it's your IT operations and not DevOps unless you're talking about cloud. APT, nation-state threats, basically do the same thing, but for somewhat of a different reason, right? Most of our attribution of which state or agency is involved in attack, it often takes place in malware analysis because it's really hard to write software that's anything remotely complex, you know, and nation-state software engineers do the same thing that normal software engineers do. Copy and paste as much as possible. Nobody likes re-implementing functions, which means, oh, once we attribute a function and we see where it is, then we could start saying, oh, these are all together, and oh, by the way, this is GRU or the PLA or whoever, right? Scripting language, I mean, scripting is scripting, right? You can redo that all the time. Usually it's smaller, right? And depending on what you want to do, it's straightforward. Usually all the APIs and things that you want to do are already present in said scripting language. And our endpoint and detection methodology of those kind of malicious behaviors is essentially non-existent. I cannot create a malware signature for a bash script or a Python script or a PowerShell script, unless it's some very specific obfuscation, which is trivially changed, which means my detection doesn't matter, right? You can do behavioral-based stuff, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this development comes about for one specific reason, is that everything we do to protect environments is essentially public. We have conferences, we talk about it, right? You know, there could be somebody affiliated with the MSS in this room. I doubt it. I've had MSS scope my talks before. It's actually quite hilarious. Like trade shows, they want to scan badges for t-shirts, you just send them up, hey, can I scan your badge? And I'm like, oh, okay, you're a spy. But everything they do is essentially private. You know, in the United States, I mean, we've got our own hackers, we've got cybercriminal, we've got NSA, right? All that stuff, top secret, SCI. If that stuff hits GitHub, somebody's going to prison, right? They can see what we're doing, we can't see what they're doing until they've done something, and we reverse engineer it, and hopefully we see it. Which means, defense is always harder in a sense than offense. That's the world we live in. So as an example of a new APT threat, right? There's something just obscure, because I think it's just hilariously genius. We don't know what state did this. I guess we're assuming it's nation state by the context. This is Mandiant's research, not ours. So, I mean, props to them for finding it. But, there was malware they found that stashes hidden data in a CLFS log file. I'm not a Windows guy. I mean, I look up what CLFS logs are, but I don't know that I've ever come up with them being stashed in Splunk or a SIM. It's stored for like mass registry changes. So it's an obscure log file that no one ever looks at. Now, granted, the best practice since, 1990 was manual review of log files, and it was absurd back then, right? Here we are, they're using obscure log files that probably aren't ingested anywhere to stash data. It's hilariously ingenious, right? But Mandiant also included some detection launcher, which I think is important to point out, because this is how we need to find these kind of things. Is, any process, writing to or loading this specific DLL or loading two specific DLLs, right? Is now we're looking at patterns instead of signatures, right? And that's how we're going to need to find stuff. Signatures are still useful, right? For easy things, and we'll talk about this. But we need to move beyond, hey, this IP is bad, this domain is bad, this hash is bad, or this signature or YAR rule indicates bad. Because you're not going to find the most significant stuff that way. You're not going to find ransomware lateral movement in your environment with a signature. You'll find it with a pattern. So, supply chain attacks, I mentioned a couple of these already to kind of spoil this slide. It's top of mind because it makes good news, right? The New York Times or CNN will cover this hack breached 1,000 organizations. It's a splashy headline, right? But, for every story of a ransomware breach, there's probably 100 that you don't hear about. And these scare people, and in part because nobody really knows how to solve the problem, because in essence we can't, right? If I don't know how many customers SolarWinds has, it's a lot. Not one of them is going to be able to do a manual source code audit of SolarWinds products. More importantly, the original supply chain vulnerability is Microsoft Windows. Really, everybody has it, right? You're going to do a source code audit. Microsoft employees have a hard time getting access to any real amount of source code because it's highly protected intellectual property. You could do a third-party audit, right? Saying, hey, you're SOC 2, you got this certification. But, for those who are older in this room, we all know that compliance doesn't equal security, and often they're at odds with one another. There's third-party risk firms that try to do, some level of approximation. Hey, this company might be less safe than others, but that's imperfect too. The reality is we can't solve the problem, and the attackers know that. It's not new. But because we've adopted cloud technology, right, it's a bigger problem, right? You wouldn't be able to have a scale of a compromise of going after Azure and breaching thousands of companies 20 years ago, right? Even having a 0-day on Microsoft and compromising lots of infrastructure is not trivial, depending on the 0-day, right? WannaCry was probably the last major example of a nice wormhole event, right? I used to teach. I was about to take worms out of my class, and then WannaCry after thinking that we're never going to see a worm again because that's not the world we're in. We're still kind of there. But like I said, there isn't much we can do about it. We could try to make it less safe. We could try to reduce the risk, right? In SolarWinds, because of the way they operated, right? If you were looking at DNS queries, you'd be able to find some interesting queries in there that were pathological. If you're looking for things that just should not be queried or are abnormal, you would have seen it. You would have known what it was, but at least it gives you a warning. Hey, Hub Team, go figure out why these endpoints are doing this that happens to have SolarWinds on it, or Orion, I think is the product off the top of my head, which shouldn't be querying stuff like that. And hopefully they reverse engineer it enough to figure it out, or at least say, you know what? We need to sit there and block some network access to this device until we figure out what's going on. Or better yet, why is any SolarWinds device reaching out to random places on the internet in the first place? So cryptocurrencies enable a lot of cybercrime, DDoS, extortion, ransomware. The lack of centralized authority means there's no one there to protect your losses. There's lots of scams out there that are there, but I'm just going to talk about DDoS extortion. DDoS has been around for 30 years. DDoS is actually the original kind of gamer exploitation. It's the gateway drug teaching teenagers how to be hackers. Other countries find these individuals and bring them into their equivalent of the IC vault. Because hey, you get around with, kicking people off the internet to win at Fortnite. I don't know. What do kids play these days? I don't know, right? But there are people out there who simply launch low-level DDoS attacks, spending some boot or service $5, say, hey, give me 50,000 in Bitcoin and we'll call it a day. They get paid even though there's really no real threat behind it. And it comes and goes, I don't know, every year or two, they crop up, they go away, they crop up, they go away. For the past, I don't know, 10 years, give or take. But fundamentally, what's DDoS protection? It's you have something in front blocking the bad traffic, you just have a big enough pipe to withstand it. Can't really solve the problem because fundamentally it's not a problem for organizations to solve. It's of networks and networks in places that don't cooperate with the United States. I like using this slide a lot. It's statistics from VirusTotal. VirusTotal is the single largest malware honeypot in the world because everybody submits files to it. On a given day right now, that looks to me like about 900,000 samples unique detected by one engine or more. The scary line is one that you can't see between the orange and yellow, the orange and red line. Right? Because there's a certain amount of malware that's malicious that nothing is detected. Obviously, we can't measure an unknown, but it's somewhere between that red and orange line, right? That's where the unknown threat lies. That's where patterns can help us. Everything with the red line and under, we've got a signature for, right? Nobody really likes antivirus because we know it's not 100% effective. I don't really care that it's not 100% effective. If it can get rid of 70% of the low red nonsense, then there's less work I've got to deal with, right? Ultimately, like I said, a math game. I'm trying to give myself less work to do because I've got more than enough, and we still don't have enough people working in the industry. The cynical and sarcastic way of addressing this problem is this, because I think it's hilarious, right? The scale of our vulnerability landscape is more than the attackers can deal with too. And this didn't come from a technical publication, it came from The Onion, which makes it that much more funny. Even people outside the industry kind of know, right? We're adopting technology we can't secure and we're putting it in more stuff. We've never secured, and just an aside of like medical devices, right? MRIs were perfectly secure until somebody stapled a PC with Windows XP on it. And it's Windows XP because that was the last operating system that Microsoft spent real effort to make for embedded or IoT devices. But nobody really thought an MRI machine should last 30 or 40 years. We're stapling an operating system that gets EOL'd after 3 or 4. You have no good answers now, right? And you can't patch it because of medical compliance. You're creating all sorts of problems because you have one threat model with Windows XP. You're putting it into something else. No one redid the threat model to say, hey, wait a second. This has got to last decades, not years. Lots of compromised information out there. There's an entire marketplace for compromised machines and accounts because the attackers are stealing so much, they're trying to find new ways to monetize it. Crypto mining, botnet crypto mining came about because people that operated banking and credit card Trojans on machines are basically waiting around for you to enter your credit card information. No, they want to make some money in the meantime. Mining cryptocurrency on consumer machines is not lucrative, right? You might make a couple of bucks a month, maybe a couple tens of bucks a month, but if you have a botnet of 250,000 nodes that's sitting around most of the time, You know, you multiply $2 a month times 250,000 machines, that's real money that you're just sitting around collecting, right? You can use it for credential stuffing, right? There's huge repositories of stolen usernames and passwords. How do you validate that, right? I can't just spin up a VPS somewhere in Ukraine to do it. But I can use somebody's compromised machine in Nebraska, right? It's easy to compromise grandma in Nebraska, or kids who are just downloading games off the internet, right? There's no shortage of compromised machines out there that you can find ways to leverage for malicious purposes. And modeling that is kind of hard because at the end of the day, what's the difference between grandma in Nebraska who wants to access her online banking account and grandma in Nebraska who wants to access her online banking account but her PC is infected and used as a credential stuffing network? A lot of the scale of this problem, you know, there's the idea that automation can fix or help. And superficially, that's true. There are more jobs than we have people. There's a need for more skills than we have, right? You know, there's an entire ecosystem of security providers because even major companies can't hire enough security people to secure their own environments. It just doesn't scale very well. So almost every enterprise has security providers. You know, any company could hire incident responders. They hire Mandiant to do the work, or CrowdStrike or somebody else. One solution is security automation, right? Or other forms of machine learning and AI. It, in theory, can reduce workload, right? But the fundamental computer security problem is how to process untrusted data and get trusted outcomes. And we have not solved that problem since it was identified. It was identified probably in the 80s, popularized by How to Smash the Stack for Fun and Profit in Frack magazine in the early 90s, and buffer overflows. But it's the same fundamental problem. What causes the problem with buffer overflows is the same as the problem with SQL injection, and the same problem we're seeing in machine learning and artificial intelligence, right? But there's this idea, math will set us free. It's unbiased, it's math. Well, no, because your math has to be based on data humans decide on, based on features that humans select, for outcomes that human beings want to achieve. And what we've noticed is that while machine learning is good at some things, it's bad at others. And it is, in some cases, like facial recognition technology, as an example. Works pretty good against people like me. Less accurate on African Americans. Okay, well, if you're Facebook, what's the impact of that? Probably not a lot. If you're a law enforcement agency using it and you start arresting the wrong people, well, now you've got a constitutional rights issue that you're correcting. I don't know why this problem exists. I don't know anybody's figured out why it exists, but it does. So quite literally, machine learning is creating systemic bias and systemic racism in the actual strict definition of systemic. Probably not a good thing, right? But the threat model's changed. Facial recognitions in Facebook is good enough. Facial recognitions for law enforcement, maybe we want to add up a couple of extra controls in there. Yeah, exactly, right? And we're seeing, well, input validation, right? Poison data set, same problem. My PhD is in machine learning. Created a model to model just, I want something that be able to tell me, is this domain good, bad, or I don't know. I managed to get a model to about 100% accuracy as long as I allowed I don't know as an answer, right? So if there's 90% confidence or higher, decide somewhere in the middle, say I don't know, and you know, there you go, right? And those somewhere in the middle where you don't know, that's where you need to do work on your model, is figure out why it doesn't know, right? Is there features you need to look at? Is there data bias? Any number of things. That's not the point of this slide. I created this model 2019, let it cook for a good long time because I don't want to be blocking and doing false positives. Nobody fires a security vendor for false negatives. They fire security vendors for false positives. That I would argue is a problem, but I don't win that argument because I sell things. You know, I have to do what the customer wants. So, it looks at various attributes of DNS. We'll skip past that for people who don't know it. But it broke catastrophically in March 2020. Has anybody in here in your career ever broken production significantly? Everybody has. It's a rite of passage. You're not really in IT until you've broken production, right? It's a rite of passage. Usually you don't do that in your 40s. I did. What happened in March 2020, right, the pandemic hit, and then everybody panicked, including government agencies. We have to respond to this. You know, there was real concern that a risk of what was going on was the breakdown of the social order, right? That was kind of the cadence people were operating in. So government agencies, who are the most strict about change control and infrastructure, threw all the red tape out the window and didn't care. They're setting up dashboards and this to figure out, we need to get the information out to the public, tell them to stay home, figure out unemployment, all of the things that were going on. My model started flagging public health authorities and knocking them offline. In my career, I didn't think I would rise to the level of false positive of interfering with a public health authority during a global pandemic. Sorry, the math said it was bad, does not save you. You know, the impact was solved fairly quickly, but the reality is, it's like reality changes underneath you, and threat models change very quickly. And hopefully, we will never experience a pandemic like we have the last couple of years, as long as I'm alive and my children or grandchildren are alive. Maybe it's a once-a-century event and we move on, right? But these things can break very bad. So how to get started in machine learning and AI? You know, open up a terminal, you know, install the sklearn library and start coding. It's very simple, right? People focus on machine learning and AI as if it's complicated math. sklearn, there's a couple of other libraries that do it, makes math easy for you, which is a benefit and a cost. Anybody can do machine learning, which means anybody can do machine learning. It's the same problem with the LAMP stack, Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. It made it possible for anybody to create a web app, and they did, which created a huge landscape of vulnerable web apps, and later vulnerable mobile apps, which in some ways are basically web apps, you know, doing all sorts of interesting things that create all sorts of risks no one ever really invented or thought of when making this ecosystem that we enjoy to create new technology. So what to do about it, right? For those of us who work in organizations, we can't control flaws in vendor software, right? You know, smaller vendors you can go put through the paces of, I want this, I want that, right? No one's going to get a source code audit of Microsoft Windows except maybe the Department of Defense. You know, the fundamental problems that incentivize ransomware and cybercrime aren't going to change anytime soon, right? We're not going to solve global law enforcement. You know, some countries, right, a lot of BEC and romance scams operate in Nigeria. The Nigerian government is sincerely helpful, where the FCC is, you know, but it's also a third world country. There's only so much they can do, right? So maybe we can solve that problem one day, but it's not here today, right? You know, hitting the wrong button on our remote control is still a problem. So what can we do about it? We know a lot about the threat landscape. You go back to the virus total slide, right? There's 900,000 malware samples that we can detect. Block them and forget them, right? There's a notion of reticence of just, I don't want to block for fear of false positives, right? I think there's things that you can do to minimize the impact of specific false positives, but really we got to block the low rent stuff. There's only so much human energy going around, and you know, a multitude of alerts drowns out more important things. And there's been public cases of that. SIM isn't bad as long as you're not using it as a digital dumpster, right? You know, checking off the box of centralized logging, right? You go in there and you've got logs from your firewalls and your networks and your DNS resolvers and your Exchange server, your AD and this, and maybe hopefully you get your EDR in there. And now you can sit there and say, oh, I've seen this network event and this network pattern and this behavior on a host opening these files. Now you can start doing real hunting versus signature-based stuff. Breaking down the wall between network system and security, right? Is that people say, hey, I'm network operations, I'm system admin, I'm security, we all can't work together. Well, the reality is the difference between system administration and system security really just needs to go away. And the same thing with network security and network operations, right? Those walls need to come down so that those because all the defenses are either applied on an endpoint or on a network device. Everybody has firewalls. Very few people are actually putting threat intelligence into their firewalls because network operators want to pass packets with as little friction as possible, and security wants to block all the bad, and you have a standoff, and that's not good. Every time we adopt a new technology, it needs to be somebody looking at the threat model, right? The risks from a webcam on my laptop are very different than risks to the camera on my phone. You know, if I want to harass somebody or I want to steal information, I want their device. If I want to kill somebody, I want their phone, right? There's an entirely different risk landscape there. We need to focus on making things resilient, right? Is that there's going to be things that get through, there's going to be business operations that are interrupted. How do you get around that with ransomware? There's a lot of people focus, we can detect this ransomware. I mean, there's machine learning tools out there to detect ransomware encrypting documents. Great. By the time that's already happening, you're already SOL, right? You know, you need something up front or something to respond quickly. You know, because failures are always going to happen, and sometimes people who moonlight as academics break things in catastrophic ways. But we're probably not going to get out of firefighting mode, right? You know, there's some younger and older people in the room, so some of this matters. But I think about this because of some recent incidents, right? There's a security researcher who died recently. You know, we do have suicides in our industry. There's a lot of mental health issues because similar mental stresses of firefighters and police in pandemics. You're doing the same thing all the time. You're seeing the bad outcomes happen all the time, and there's very little that you can do about it. That creates a mental health toll, right? So celebrating small victories and taking care of your own mental health. Actually having work-life balance. I think we made a joke before the talk started. What's a weekend? You know, well, it used to be when I could work from home for a couple of days and not have to go to the office, but now we're all working from home in a pandemic. You know, of taking time off, because it is a stressful industry, and we have lost some of our colleagues due to suicide and other things because of the unique strains, or not unique, the similar strains first responders have in their work. So be mindful of that. With that, maybe I will take questions. And if you want a copy of my slides, there's my contact information. I'm happy to share them.
Just one thing, there are no small wins. A win is a win celebrated.
Exactly. I think another way of saying it, a win is a win. There are no small wins. Right? So, I'm trying to think of how many different criminal cases I've helped investigate. Dozens, at least. I've only got 2 indictments. 1 arrest. One guy actually he didn't do time. Yeah, he actually basically processed out of the Bureau of Prisons and then walked out on probation. That's the closest to putting somebody behind bars I've ever gotten, spending years of effort on some of these cases. As somebody who just got processed and walked out the door, you know.
Early in my career, I used to be able to get the money back from wire fraud. Now, it's likely I'm not going to. So if I get any money back, it's a win.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's generally not the consumers that are losing the money, and they don't have insurance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's often very little, question or point session. Yes, sir.
Obviously, IoT, industrial IoT, technologies that begin to emerge, overlook security deficit areas. Is there anything on your radar on the state that you see? The way I phrase it is, you can't protect technologies of yesterday. What the hell are we thinking of protect the future technology? Is there anything on your radar beyond the IoT, industrial IoT, other industrial sectors that should be watching? That are becoming emerging threats because they were just weak.
Correct. So, if I can paraphrase the question, right? With IoT, right, and we're putting new devices online that in some ways have some of the vulnerabilities that devices had 20 years ago. MRIs, the number of embedded IoT machines that have telnet run, a protocol I thought we murdered 10 years ago that somehow came back. The fundamental problem there is people making MRI machines are medical equipment manufacturers, not IT system integrators. So they haven't learned any of the lessons that we
the single biggest improvement to cybersecurity in my career in 2 decades was when Microsoft made software updates default apply, on patch Tuesday. Because nobody patched crack before that. They realized that, we're going to make that the default behavior. Your machine's just going to reboot on Tuesday night. Tremendous gains in cybersecurity that nobody in the IoT or embedded system world knows because they're not IT integrators. They're Siemens who make industrial control systems, not to pick on Siemens, but just a vendor, right? These are people who are car manufacturers, same thing, right? They make cars, no one's there thinking about it. So part of this, cybersecurity needs to be taught all these other manufacturing disciplines. So I'm kind of trying to encourage that community college and university levels of saying, at least get people thinking about this, the mentality of what could go wrong. And it kind of works in the Western world. When I was an adjunct at UOI for 6 years, I'd start my class with this exercise. Here, somebody think of some new technology. Somebody would name something, right? Now, tell me how you would kill somebody. The Asian students, they didn't understand how to process this question because of cultural differences, so I kind of had to be really careful about how I played this. The Americans, were okay with it. But the fundamental thing is the same. It's like, think of what bad could happen, legitimately. And that is a very specific, small subset of the human population that can do that. In essence, non-weaponized sociopaths. I don't know how else to describe it, right? Normal people don't think of how to kill other people. But, if you're doing a self-driving car, that's a legitimate thing to concern, right? What can I do to trick this car in thinking that pedestrian is a sidewalk? Or not a sidewalk, a crosswalk right on the street, which is a very specific failure that did lead to a pedestrian. So, emerging technology, I'm looking just at the machine learning level with my research, and nobody's really thinking about it. Thinking, we can enable all this stuff, right? Is being in the right place at the right time and asking the right question. You're adopting this technology here. Have you thought about X? Now, the answer is going to be no, and if you're lucky, you'll start thinking about it. Or, a buried head in the sand, right? And I probably had more buried the head in the sand in my 20 years career than not. But I've at least discharged my responsibility.
You're talking, right?
Did that answer your question? Any other questions? I think I can take one more.